Welcome to the Awakening You podcast. Today I'm going to talk about perpetual strife and bounded rationality, assimilating parapsychology as a microcosm of societal issues throughout time. I presented this shortened version of this at the International Conference on Thinking. And one of the things I realized is that, I continue to realize that these ideas about spirituality are kind of just beneath the surface of consciousness, and we're kind of stuck in not being able to make the full jump and integrate it. And parapsychology is a microcosm of that. We'll talk about that. In the opening keynote, the presenter, he's a Harvard professor in the area of education, and he talked about 4 pillars of that we need to stress, and one of these, the last one he presented, was intuition. And the way he described it, you could tell he was just talking about God's will. In his description of intuition, he described it, intuition as the fast thinking brain and slow thinking brain. It's the same idea as consciousness and unconscious. And he's describing how this fast thinking brain is useful and it works. And he's talking about how the research is saying that cultivating intuition is a worthwhile thing. I'm sitting there and it's like, yeah, he's just talking about connecting with your higher self, and he's describing it in the similar ways. And this is theme of recognizing what this last step in integrating, coming full circle and integrating spirituality back into science is just prevalent everywhere. From in the field of genetics, we started out with pure science and nature, and then it came to nature versus nurture. And now, in a class I took, Dr. Robert Licklider, he described that it's really just one thing, and nature and nurture. It's not even that there's both, it's that they're just this one thing. And this is moving towards oneness. And neuroscience, it was started out as different brain regions provide different functions, and now we realize that every region is kind of somewhat involved in everything, and you really need to think about the brain as a network. And it's moving towards holism, and there's this move towards holism, and we're recognizing that we need to integrate the fields in all realms in science. And once you integrate the fields, to do that, you'd have to include the spiritual component. You have to include God. So there's this move in the right direction, while at the same time, we still have this fear of explicitly talking about spirituality within science. And it's no longer a matter of evidence, as I'll describe with parapsychology. It's a matter of we're stuck in our bounded rationality. And this bounded rationality is the same underlying issue that leads to, world wars, eugenics, the Holocaust, and it's been going on throughout time. So this last step that we're trying to take, we got to address the issue of what's holding us back to integrating new knowledge. Today I'm going to describe how the unconscious and fear repression works on the societal level, the psychological history of humanity, to inform and use that to inform where society is headed, so we can see where we're going and start orienting ourselves towards that and avoid just continuing, consciously continuing where we are, to integrate the unconscious. And the blocks, talk about the blocks that have always impeded integration of paradigm shifting knowledge, and using parapsychology as an example, and describe how our youth and human population as general is suffering to neglect of what the unconscious is telling us and where it's trying to get us. And this forms the foundation of psychoanalytics and Jungian psychology is trying to understand what the unconscious is doing, and I'm going to talk about what that's doing at a larger scale. So, what are the primary obstacles to effective group interactions throughout time? We have religious differences, language differences, different views on politics and economics, and all other aspects of culture are these blocks, and we have to. It's not something that's ever been solved, and that's what we need to solve. So, um, there's a little bit on why that's from a psychology neuroscience perspective, what it says about these blocks. So, the brain is functionally a goal-directed behavior machine. So, you have an idea of where you want to go, and then your brain uses its beliefs to map out a plan to get there. So you can imagine if you have throughout time as we have interacting cultures, that different cultures have different beliefs, so they're going to have not only prioritize different goals, but when they come together and we're trying to get the same goals, and it's the same goal, everyone wants world peace, but we can't get to there because our belief systems are telling us that there's our own ways to go about getting there. And we identify with our groups. It's just implicit in group conflict is implicit within how we interact, because we feel threatening by out groups because their beliefs are contradict yours, and thus contradict the best way to go about things. And that's just a general description. This is what I talk about on my website more. So this is conceptualizing the role of the unconscious. It's a obviously complicated subject, but what we have is, before science, we had Christianity and we had other religions. They were kind of separated. And the religion was our identity, and that's projecting out the internal God image onto religion, and that's what we identify with. And then science came along and uprooted religion. There's a reason for that, and I'll talk about that. But it uprooted religion, and then we're identifying with ideologies. And Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, "God is dead," and he predicted that there would be horrible things to happen in the 20th century, and he predicted this in the late 1800s, and obviously he was right. So we want to understand, like, what was he seeing? Like, why was he so on point with what was going on? And more importantly, why wouldn't anyone listen to him? So if we have good ideas and no one listens to them, then it doesn't do us any good. And another example of this is Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein in the 1930s Germany, he was called an atrocity monger, and that's it's a very sad thing. And he was speaking out against unreasonableness, and obviously he was right. But why would someone who was so obviously correct being labeled an atrocity monger? And it's actually because he was a threat to the status quo belief systems. So he actually got shadow projected upon for bringing to light the irrationality of the way things were. The way things were identity. We have identity politics, and ideological identity is something we're still trying to recover from. And that came about because technology we always have this desire for group identity, and we need to change what we identify with primarily to get over that. So, insights on psychology of chaotic times. This is there's always been chaotic times, and the Babylonian myth of Marduk and Tiamat is at the roots of our religion. This goes way back before Christianity. And what this myth describes is the man god or god Marduk conquering Tiamat, the goddess of chaos, I think it was. She was this chaos in the unknown, and he cut this monster, whatever, up in pieces and created order out of it. And that's what we're going through right now. We have this chaos in this but it's unexplored chaos and unknown. We have to face it head on. And this is, in anyone's life, making order out of chaos is how you create. And this is a creation myth of God. There is nothing, is this a void, black chaos, and that's yin and yang. It's the feminine principle. The feminine principle is related to the Tiamat. You see that connection between East and West. But we always know that's where new creation comes from the unknown, chaos, the void. It's also the myth in Western traditions. Dragon guards the gold. The fearsome dragon guards what you need most. What you want is always where you least want to find it. In conquering, the hero conquers the dragon and takes the gold, and that's symbolic of helping society with their issues. Christ, same thing. He stood up against immorality. He stood up for the truth, but then he got crucified, but in the end, he resurrected on him and was like, take that. I'll talk more about that. So, and that ended up establishing Western civilization and bringing order to the differentiated religions of paganism. And in your own life, it's consciously choosing what seems more difficult, but also more important for your future growth. You're facing something that you're not comfortable with, you're unknown, but then that's where you need to do most. And talk more about that in other podcasts. So this is a present and timeless issue. And fundamentally, the culture is shared group repressions or blind spots. And that's the chaos. And we in these ideological conflict, and the world is coming together, and it seems like we can't solve any of these issues. It seems insolvable. That's just because we're not looking where we don't want to look as a culture. I mean, there's people out there, but we need to, what are the blocks towards all of us trying to deal with what we need to deal with? And you see that in politics, ideological strife, friends, that's when you say it's other people's fault and focus on the surface issue without doing the soul searching. And in parapsychology, I'll talk more about this, but there's a fear of collapse of society as we know it. And that's that fear of dealing with something unknown with regards to parapsychology and the unconscious. And it's kind of like science needs to collapse and restructure around pillars of truth that prioritize truth over the incentive system we have in place, where it's about grants and tenure. I mean, there needs to be some kind of mechanism to identify people who are doing good, but we also need to factor in the truth, because that's causing damage to, it's a microcosm of world issues. And Jung, he described shadow projection as the number one issue facing society. It's a projection of your problems onto other people that cause world war, slavery, eugenics, gun violence, and intractable depression. So I have this quote: "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own?" Once again, what we're going through right now, it's nothing new. It's that quote's describing belief bias, is what we call it in psychology and neuroscience today. And we still haven't solved it, and it's still causing all the problems. And I got on the screen a picture of ego maintenance loop. So science and knowledge, discovery of science and knowledge, it exists within a paradigm, and it's anything outside that paradigm is automatically resisted because you have a system set up to foster, to support the paradigm. So the way science is now, it can't really just go out and seek truth because it doesn't have a perspective upon itself, allows it to see the big picture and see how their own beliefs are affecting what they're actually researching. And when you get caught up in, the chaoticness of the days, and you lose sight of the fact that there's other information out there, and it's not even that it's not aware of that information out there. It's that we don't know how to integrate it into our current ego maintenance loop. And that's, we notice that in all of our lives, and we just can't seem to integrate new information even if it's helpful. So to do that, we must factor in the relationships to beliefs and associated assumptions upon reality, because we're not just discovering new knowledge if it's paradigm shifting. We're discovering something that can only be realized if we also change the culture around it. That's what I'll talk about with parapsychology. And fundamentally, it's a cultural repression mechanism for incompatible knowledge. You have everyone else is doing it, rationalizations. You have a fear of social exclusion for doing stuff outside the loop. And it's really just defending the current ego's beliefs, shadow projection, and psychoanalysis. It's called the transcendent function that's necessary in doing this on an individual level because it requires self-reflection, changing your beliefs, and transformation of the individual. And that's not obviously a priority in the realm of science. And it's been called bounded rationality. I had a previous episode, I called it logical insanity. And this idea of zombies. I'm not just hearing it. You have eyes and ears, but you can't see or hear. And yeah, it's an archetype of good versus evil, in that you have a resistance to good by the evil. The good is truth. Fear and love, chaos, order, hero myth. So I have a picture of what I'm calling the ego replacement theory of human progression. There's a lot in this, but this fits into what we know about human history and how things change over time. It started before polytheism, but I'm starting at polytheism. Polytheism transformed into monotheism, and it did so by realizing new unconscious information and integrating that into consciousness. The Christ was an archetype of the self, of wholeness, and it was a revolutionary idea because it took individual gods and realized it got closer to the idea of the brain, that it's inside yourself, and wholeness comes through love, and it's within inside yourself. And Christ, it was kind of like a thing, an idea floating in the air, and it constellated in this maybe historical person or myth before. It was around, there's stories and Gnosticism, or maybe it's not Gnosticism, but 100 years before the actual Christ, there was another Christ, and then this Christ figure, Christ consciousness, seemed to be popping in and out of people's heads. And that's what we find ourselves in today with this knowledge. It's kind of, a lot of people are realizing it. Same thing. And monotheism got uprooted by science. I'll talk more about that. But you have this movement over time towards a greater capacity for unity that unfolds in logical stages. So if you have polytheism, it's going to be hard to get a group of people throughout Western civilization on the same page. You're not going to be able to cooperate towards common goals so well if you're all believing in your own gods. So yeah, monotheism allows for that, and now science is uprooting religion, and that is allowing for the potential for everyone to reorganize around new ideas as they're no longer possessed, projecting out their god image upon their gods. Now they have science, and science kind of made it harder to believe in organized religion, but it's because it became dogmatic, but and it had to be uprooted. But we got to we're trying to realize the positive potential of this movement, and we're going to have to get past the in science to do that. So the idea is that the emerging loop is based on science merging with spirituality to create a new paradigm of greater unity that's not can extend across cultures as we all identify with our spiritual self instead of our group ideologies and organize separate religions. So the obstacles to this is bound rationality. There's a long history of resisting new truth. Herbert Simon coined the term bound rationality, and it's the way it is. It's just the way it is. We just got to do it. It's not. You can't change it. And examples: Aristotle has resistance from the church. He couldn't talk about his ideas openly without feeling a threat for his life by this ego resistance. Math was like occult magic. Miasma's theory, which describes the stink in the air hypothesis of disease spread, and people at the time started recognizing like this is washing our hands is helping a lot more than addressing the stink. And of course they were right. They were describing bacteria on the hands, but that idea got resisted and thousands of people died because of it. Junk DNA is not vogue anymore in genetics research. We know that it's probably just doing stuff we don't understand. Discovery of the atom, that was resisted. The Big Bang was resisted. And I'm not particularly keen on something like the Big Bang as being an ultimate answer, but is the idea that was resisted, and now everyone it's common knowledge. Evolution was resisted. Funny story with Max Planck was that his advisor told him that he should go into art or music because there was no discoveries left to make in physics. And here we are 100 years later, and we're confused about physics as ever. So we need to recognize not necessarily so much like what new knowledge we need. That's a part of it, but more importantly, we need to recognize why we can't integrate this new knowledge and how the ego is preventing that. Because if a Friedrich Nietzsche or Einstein are trying to tell us something and we're not going to listen to them, it's not going to be very helpful. That doesn't do us any good. So you don't want to collectively be able to see what they were seeing. So yeah, what is the emerging unconscious information vying for integration? I have a schematic of unconscious guidance throughout history. This is a very broad, general picture of it. So we started off before pagan. We had animism. Animism describes how spirit was everything kind of idea, and then archetypes became constellated within the conscious mind, and then became projected upon gods, and that led to paganism. Different cultures had different gods. That kind of structured around some higher, integrating some higher realm knowledge into consciousness. And then you have the Christ archetype, constellated, created monotheism. Then we have scientism comes along, uprooting. It had to come along. It had occult traditions. It's not something we'll talk about, but science emerged from the Hermetic tradition, which is essentially ritual magic. Interesting stories about John Dee and the birth of he coined the term the British Empire. And the British Empire was actually kind of had roots in angels trying to integrate this, trying to help guide them towards the formation of something. They probably didn't know it at the time, but they started the British Empire and it led to America. The angels, telling them the plan, and Moses, likely angels, Christ, God. So all of these movements, all these major movements, are not something that came from the existing paradigm. These were knowledge that came from, you can call it angels or God, but it's all under the idea of information that's unconscious to the average person. And John Dee, the religion he was long term, he never realized it, but was an individual connection with higher powers. And that's exactly what I came to realize in my own spiritual experience, and that's what my guidance was telling me the whole time. And it's interesting to see that it's the same thing, and also there's other people, but personal, decentralized, you can call it decentralized religion. The basic idea is where it's religion, it's moving full circle. It seems to be going back towards animistic ideas where everything's, but at a different, quietly different conceptualization of it as spirit, unity, consciousness, everything. We call it conscious. They didn't have ideas like consciousness and unconscious, but the idea that everything's somewhat conscious or has the ability to interact with consciousness. And I have this other graph. So you imagine you're going from point A to point B, but there's an undefined path towards point B, but you're still going to point B. And multiple paths, one destination. That seems to be the result of free will. So what is the emerging paradigm? And catching the wave. So you have a greater capacity for unity, and that's being reflected in the internet, decentralization of cryptocurrencies, trying to eliminate central powers, because that prevents unity, because that just fosters ideological strife and inequality. You have unearthing repressions that happens throughout paganism, moved to monotheism. They were kind of realizing how these animal rituals, they got past the animal rituals, and I'm not an expert on that, but a funny story is in the Bible, one of the prophets was describing how ridiculous it was that people were praising to a particular god of agriculture, and they were rationalizing their partaking in prostitution. Nothing against prostitution in particular, but obviously that's a ridiculous thing when you're saying, oh, we're going to do this to help our crops. It's like, you're not helping your crops. That doesn't make any sense. So this same thing, we're getting it's a period of self-reflection and seeing that things are not as they seem. And we're going to have to go to something better. And you have rampant conspiracy beliefs, distrust in authority figures and government, general dismantling of dogmatic systems, increasing ridiculousness, polarization, and all that is just looking in the mirror and seeing like this isn't right. Climate change, not going to talk about the science of that, but it's clearly an archetype of rebirth to the Great Mother. Great long history of literature on this, and I experienced this in my spiritual experience of a concern of Mother Nature, and that's because it's an archetype for rebirth rebirth through the mother, rebirth through nature. The hero goes out into nature and is transformed. And there's this possession of concern over nature. And you have this wacky climate change that's become so politicized, and that's because it's it's fundamentally irrational, and the science is wacky, but I'm not going to talk about if it's real. And that's because it's possession, and we know it's this unconscious idea of something's happening, and we're projecting it out when it's really an internal thing. We project out, we kind of neglect the unconscious, so that feeling of rebirth is being projected out into another nature. And the ends of empires throughout history, there's always been a rise of feminism and demasculization, but we need to put that in perspective and realize that it's really just about psychological wholeness and rebirth, and equality is a part of it, but that's not the real meaning of if we're focusing on particular issues, we can talk about those issues, but we need to see it in the big picture. And the big picture is spiritual in nature. We'll never get out of this in a positive way if we don't recognize the big picture. Popular culture, just interesting things I've noticed: zombies and their popularity. When I kind of got onto the idea that the unconscious projects out into the culture, so there's a big popularity in Walking Dead, zombies, Game of Thrones. There's a lot of zombie movies, and that's telling the unconscious, telling us that we are like zombies to the spiritual knowledge. And I've come to realize that if you're listening to this, you're probably not so zombie anymore. So congratulations. But they need our love. It's not like they need love to wake up, because it's kind of you stay a zombie because the truth can be a lot to bear. And also, the origins of the word zombie are actually God fetish. And now it's an interesting synchronicity, because the fetish is an unhealthy relationship. So basically, it's an unhealthy relationship with God, and that's exactly what this is. In other films, The Matrix and apocalyptic films, once again, they're providing us a metaphor for what is going on. The signs are all around us. UFOs and mandalas, whether they're physically real or not, isn't really it's relevant, but not to this. It's a sense of greater cosmic significance that you get when seeing UFOs and just thinking about UFOs. And that's exactly what we need to do in this period: realize our place in the universe, to unite. And prescription drugs, that's just a sad thing that we're giving people drugs because we're suppressing or ignoring the spiritual truth. And all we can do within this chaotic, irrational paradigm, if you can't talk about spirituality, then you're going to have the only thing left is because that is the only solution to these problems. So if you're ignoring the only solution, you have to do something like just suppress it and numb it. And East versus West coming together, that's call it an archetype. But the Western civilization went out, discovered science. It's kind of it's coming full circle back towards spirituality. And that's actually the origins of science. You had occultism and ritual magic. The people who developed science in the aristocrats of Elizabethan age, they were very into magic and spirituality, but they realized to get science off the ground, they were going to have to separate out science from that and make science and spirituality two separate things. and now it's coming back, basically. And it's also coming back towards, in a bigger picture, back towards Eastern philosophies of oneness. I talk about that if you want to listen to that in a previous podcast. So, parapsychology is one of these things that we just can't seem to get into the loop. So, parapsychology studies psychic phenomena that includes telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, reincarnation, apparitional experiences, near-death experiences, and other paranormal claims. A Society for Psychical Research was founded in 1882 in London. Stanford University began studying ESP in 1911. J.B. Ryan popularized with the 1937 book Frontiers of Mind. It played a role in the breakup of Freud and Jung. They had a disagreement on the importance of how, well, I think they both thought it was important, but Freud was more concerned about the social ramifications and trying to perhaps have psychoanalysis taken seriously by science, and that's just a fear of the archetype of perpetual strife we'll talk about, a fear of doing what's truthful for social reasons. And Jung went ahead and kept going towards that, studying the synchronicities, he called them. And actually, during one of their arguments while they were breaking up, there was apparently there was a vase or some kind of ceramic something in a different room, and it exploded. In Jung's life, he is kind of full of these experiences that are guided him and shaped him towards the spiritual. The Parapsychological Association was founded in 1957. There was a person who researched this stuff back in the 1960s. He was on a Saturday night talk show, and he requested people to send him letters of anything unusual with time dilation. We call them synchronicities. And this is just a regular late night show on a Saturday night. And you end up getting 3,000 letters on personal experiences. So this is something that maybe it's gone down in recognition, because it's kind of if you build it, they will come kind of idea with spiritual and synchronistic experiences. But there's a lot of people who experience these things. It was used by the CIA and the Stargate project, telepathy, remote viewing stuff. And it's probably probably more secret now, but the higher ups are using this stuff. It's pretty standard. Related UFO phenomenon, collective unconscious archetypes. So it's not about the evidence. There's extensive scientific literature. When you Google Scholar search parapsychology, you get 31,800 results. There's 13 university departments who study this stuff. It's of obvious relevance to brain science. It's easy to believe, hard to understand. It's fitting it into the loop issue. And it's not reasonable or mature to ignore the evidence. It's kind of the zeitgeist, but it's not true at all. Science is not objective. It's because the culture can't assimilate it. And naturally, marginalized information will not be understood well. An institute that studies that, Institute of Noetic Science, they have a program that studies this stuff. It's just focused on parapsychology. University of Virginia has an interesting program, Division of Perceptual Studies, that includes the studies of reincarnation. In a lab that I worked in at the University of Michigan was studying near-death experiences by inducing cardiac arrest in rats. And the problem with finding DMT within the brain has been that it degrades so quickly. And what they did, ingeniously did, they inserted a tube basically that went right toward the base of the pineal gland, so they were able to suck into this microdialysis tube what was coming out right at the base of the pineal gland And there they were able to prove that DMT is in fact made in the pineal gland. It had kind of been a idea people assumed, but because all the precursors were there and similar molecules are made there, serotonin and melatonin are similar, just a couple steps uh, away from DMT. And also, that's a synchronicity in my life that I would have this crazy supernatural experience. When I worked in a lab that studied near-death experiences, it kind of felt like dying while alive. Quotes from parapsychologists: "The biggest issue is horrendous public misinformation about parapsychology as a whole that is fueled by the media, compounded by complete ignorance of the field's experimental research, and exacerbated by lack of funds for psi research. And lack of research positions in future as parapsychologists, ruining one's academic reputation and peace of life." And that's this issue we're going to have to, like, that shouldn't happen when discovering, searching, trying to just learn about something that's obviously important. We're not going to understand the brain while neglecting all this and the unconscious in general. And that's having very negative consequences on the public health, general sanity of the world. Global Consciousness Project, something people might have heard of, is when the random number generating went way beyond chance, changed way beyond chance in the lead up to 9/11. And about 50% of the general public believe in ESP. So it's not about the evidence. It's objectively true. It's of obvious relevance to understanding the brain, of obvious relevance to mental health, because it's a part of who we are, but it can't get assimilated. And that's the problem. Another example: transformation, pivoting to the effects on people. After near-death experiences, people experience increased psychic abilities, increased compassion, decreased in competitiveness and materialist beliefs, increased in sense of meaning, and brings balance to the personality. Scientifically, these experiences, which have more clear memories, and there is more clear memory formation, more vivid memories are forming during a state where the brain is dead. It's a cardiac arrest state, but yet they are having these experiences, which that doesn't fit into any model on brain activity. And that's why one of the many reasons why this stuff gets resisted. It doesn't fit into how things are supposed to work. And it's very sad, because patients in intensive care are scared to tell their stories. They are afraid people won't take them seriously, especially doctors and scientists. So you have these people having these good experiences, and then they're afraid of what people will think about them, because doctors and scientists are defending their own beliefs, and that's a problem. The meaning of data. So the brain is seemingly, the brain is more along the lines of a receiver of consciousness, not consciousness itself, and that's an idea would change everything, and that's why it's resisted. And to believe that NDEs couldn't be something supernatural, it only comes about because you'd have to ignore the larger body of evidence regarding non-local consciousness and parapsychology, because if you're factoring in that evidence, then all of a sudden it becomes reasonable. But if you're ignoring it, then you can keep yourself in the fog of misunderstanding. And that's characteristic of how science maintains its zeitgeist, by keeping the branches separate and ignoring knowledge. Then you're allowed to believe things that aren't actually based in the evidence, because you're walling off evidence that disagrees with what you believe. That's called ontological bracketing. That's what I'm talking about. So Dr. Jack Hunter, he's starting this thing, this field. He's calling it anthropsychology, and it's the paranormal throughout time because it's played a major role in the development of everything. It literally underlies everything. The parapsychology in the West, we don't believe it, and that's a problem. It's maintained in the West. It's maintained by this ontological bracketing of information where we keep information separate. And that just to reinforce the mainstream consensuses. And yeah, problem with parapsychology itself is that itself needs to integrate into life experiences because you're describing these reducing dramatic life experiences of psi to laboratory experiences, and we need to realize in the culture to realize what parapsychology actually means, because it's not really about lab experience, it's about spirituality and stuff. What Dr. Hunter proposes is ontological flooding. Just put everything on the same level and just do what makes sense, basically. It's the opposite of, we need to reorganize on our effort just to do what makes sense and do what rights for people and be compassionate and about what's we're doing to people by suppressing this information. Instead, we're just concerned about our own lives and defending our own beliefs, and that's just epidemic. A science that isn't concerned about the truth, it's not science, it's just a part of everything, a part of culture. It's just a microcosm of the bigger picture. So I'm not going to talk about this much here. This is a big topic, but areas of interest for brain spirit interfacing. So you have a spirituality, how does it interface with the brain? There's areas people are looking into. You have stochastic binding and protein configurations. When a molecule binds to a protein to activate it, put it in its active configuration, it's probabilistic. It could bind or not bind, and that's called stochastic binding. A protein channel a molecule could be bound to it, but it's still probabilistic of whether it's open or not. So that opens the door for mental effort affecting the probability, perhaps. And you also have Penrose and Hammerhoff they have a quantum-based theory. Within a cell, we focus on neurons. We focus on the synapses in the communication between neurons through electrical charges, but there's a underlying cytoskeleton of the cell called microtubules, and that they describe it as and they defended this theory for 30 years, but it has the potential to act like a quantum computer because it can create essentially a template that expands. Well, it's complicated. I'll just say it allows for the potential for some kind of 0-point energy interfacing with the brain. And synchronicity, Jung describes that maybe just this entire thing is just a synchronicity, and it only appears to be one thing to be causing another. And that idea is seeming bizarre, that it could be that perfect, or that it's all just seems like it's correlated to consciousness. Well, it is correlated to, because it's just a synchronistically co-occurring with, but there's probably some degree of that because I experience these bizarre synchronicities, and it's possible it could all be a synchronicity, but we can't even. And these ideas are naturally not going to be well understood when the whole area of parapsychology and spirituality is intentionally repressed, and that's intentionally keeping things in the fog, so you have the excuse as to say we don't understand them. But it's just again, a ego maintenance loop issue, not a science issue. My ideas about this, I'm thinking of it like a dream. I'm, um, the physical world can be conceptualized as a dream originating from higher states of consciousness. The dream is akin to a repression to be processed and brought to consciousness. Like a dream, the reality is incompatible. This reality is incompatible with the higher state. The only purpose of real meaning and inevitability is to transcend this by awakening to the truth. So, in a dream, if you're when you have a lucid dream, you can imagine how it'd be difficult to describe to dream characters that the fact that you are dreaming. But you're never gonna you can't change a dream intentionally while you're unconscious to the fact you're dreaming. That's what dreams are. And it's the same idea as what's going on now. If we want to change this world and get out of this loop, it's not going to be done by not recognizing the unconscious or higher, bringing information about a higher self down into this reality. Without doing that, we're just asleep. And science, mainstream science, they're like it's like a dreamer's not realizing they're dreaming. You can say the dreamers might see flying pigs and you're in the dream too, but you're lucid. And they're all freaking out about the flying pigs, and you're just like, they're just a dream. And they're trying to shoot down the pigs, and you're just don't just focus on who you actually are. And if you focus on who you actually are, then you'll be able to solve these issues. And it's become just focusing on the truthful information, because the science all around us. And this picture of the self and the ego. The self is like the dreamer. The self is the higher state dreamer. The ego is the dream. And we have to, it's always in psychology and analytics, from the self, the self is trying to force us in a certain direction. And it can either be bad forcing, where we don't recognize what it's doing, or we can intentionally wake up to it and work with it. And also, our egos cannot see spirit. So then as our ability to not see them, it gets translated to it not existing. It's just a unconscious dreamer idea. Yeah. Awakening to the deeper truth is blocked by prioritizing the material world. Yeah, it is blocked. We're afraid of waking up because it tells us that everything isn't as what it seemed, and it can be sometimes painful truth, when you realize. I woke up and I realized I was pretty much unconscious my whole life. I was a PhD student in neuroscience, but I still was not even aware. And you can do all that stuff and just not even be awake, and that's just like a dream. And now I saw how the unconscious was guiding me my whole life, or you call it a higher self or God. And now I can just see how it's guiding humanity, basically, and trying to wake up dreamers. So bounded rationality. That's why we can't accept these ideas. Today we have a problem of bounded rationality of many is the integration of psychic phenomenon and spirituality into science, despite clear limitations of current theories on consciousness and the reality of the evidence. So issues facing consciousness research, psychology, and neuroscience. You have the binding problem. The binding problem describes that you have different brain regions do different functions, but then how do they come together to create a smooth stream of consciousness? If you have different regions doing different functions, there's going to be a timing issue in getting all these things, creating, the stream. But there's no single spot in the brain where consciousness is. It's all the parts. And that's where the Hammerhoff and Penrose ideas of microtubules being a quantum interface and creating a template that can go beyond communicate between neurons without having to and bring everything together. I'll just call it that's a lot. I can't talk about that. Qualia, it's the fact that subjective experiences is immaterial. That's an issue that can't be solved from the materialist perspective on the brain. The hard problem is the same issue. How does consciousness, how could it ever arise from brain matter? And the truth is that it doesn't. It's coming from outside this realm. It's interfacing with the brain, and it's related to brain activity and associated with it. It kind of seems to tune it into this reality, but it is not it. It's another issue, a sad issue, is that mental health is worsening as the neuroscience of the brain progresses, and we're focusing on the wrong problems. When we're trying to characterize brain mechanisms we don't have the insight to realize that that's not actually going to help anything besides say something is bad and it just pushes the problem and you just keep pushing the problems around. And as we push up the problems around and ignore the real issues, things are getting worse. In severe use depression, 2012, it was 5.9%. Now it's 8.2%. 59.6% of college students report anxiety, increasing suicide, and these are all-time highs, all at the point where we're having rapid progress in psychology. And that's obviously not, if your concern is to increase grant funding, then yeah, if you're trying to grow a program and get more money, then it doesn't matter if you're actually addressing these problems but there is a way. I'm going to try to describe a way to where we can do both, and that takes the cultural change. Because let's talk about more why that's a problem. So the potential solution, we got to think outside the box and factor in what the unconscious is telling us, because throughout time, changes have always been initiated by unconscious sources of information, just like a dream. You wake up and control a dream. You control a dream by realize that there's a higher dimension of you, and that's merging science with spirituality would do, in effect. And yeah, it's good. But to get to, that all makes sense, and all we have this information that seems to count to spirituality, but how do we get to the point of integrating it, actually realizing the potential positive effects? It would be positive effects, because that's inevitable. That's the only path towards peace. That's the lesson we're supposed to get. That it's all spirituality is the only, or God, or whatever. And not dogmatic spirituality. True personal connections with your higher self or God. That's what I call the strife archetype, and creating a conscious awareness of archetypes is how they become neutralized, and that's the strategy here, just awareness. So I have this, call it the prism, where you have core beliefs. You can imagine a prism, a light's coming into a prism, and where it hits first, it's going to affect how the light fractionates onto everything that comes after it. What comes after it, after the unconscious, which includes things like just reflections of what unconscious is, and this includes ESP, parapsychology, archetypes, collective unconscious, spirituality, and all these things have to get intentionally ignored by the more surface beliefs, because those more surface concerns feel threatened by it, because it knows that dealing with those and taking those things out of the fog is going to shine light on the flaws in issues, and everyone's afraid of having their um, the truth about things they're doing wrong brought to light. And that's the problem. So at the surface beliefs, where we focus on issues that aren't going to really affect anything because we're keeping the fog and we're casting a shadow on ourselves by not dealing with the core beliefs, is you have politics and ideology. It's an illusionary effect on physical reality. You're not really changing anything. You're just moving issues around. And organized religion and science kind of doing the same thing. Science, well, it's progressing in knowledge. It's not really doing anything to help the mental health. We're having material gains, but we're moving in a direction. Consciously, our conscious direction is going in a bad direction, but we can change that by seeing the big picture in the archetypes. Archetypes allow you to see the big picture, and that's what I talked about in a previous slide, in a previous presentation. So yeah, you don't change anything without dealing with the repressed content. I would say this whole reality is a repression of a higher self, which is a good thing. It's a good. We're like the shadow repression of a higher dimension, but that means that there is a higher dimension. So, and that means we can wake up to it in this reality. So, ego replacement resistance. What are the issues facing? Some of the issues facing what is the resistance to parapsychology? Well, parapsychology, like I talked about in the previous slide, it highlights how much we don't know. It leads to reflection on the reflection on the paradigm, and that's exactly what the paradigm tries to resist. The ego resists self-reflection and getting at what's unconscious to it, because that is the death of it, essentially. But we don't want this paradigm because it's crazy and people are going insane. Fear of losing privacy of our own mind. We have a fear of not knowing how to go about it. You just got to be honest and speak the truth. And Dr. Jason Giorgiani described in his book Atlas and Prometheus how what I had been talking about in the implication parapsychology and spirituality isn't resisted because it's not real. It's resisted because the cultural and political and economic systems that can't exist in their current form if we were to fully realize what this evidence means. But at the same time, you can see how the physical world is starting to reflect what's going on at the unconscious level. And that's what I talked about at the beginning, where, for example, take something like the internet and technology. Technology on the internet, we're kind of losing our privacy of our thoughts. We're going to be able at some point to have an AI that can figure out more about you than what you know by analyzing your internet presence. And that's once we can do that, then these ideas might feel less threatening. This idea like cultivating telepathy. That's like, ooh, cultivating telepathy. I don't want people being able to read my own mind. Well, the internet's going to kind of getting to that point where people in charge of the internet, whoever powers that be, whoever, they're going to be able to know that stuff about you. And we can either wake up to our divine essence and own it, or we can have other people own us, basically. Pandora's box of new information. It's once you get into the unconscious and parapsychology, it's just lots of stuff we don't know. And that's the same idea as the Marduk and Tiamat myth that our culture is based upon. Pandora's box from the unconscious, and it's threatening, but we have to make order of it. We have to be Marduks. We have to be the hero taking down the dragon. People do not like talking. This is the defense mechanism. People do not like talking about things they don't understand, so they intentionally keep them in the fog. That's what we're doing. We have issues like within psychology. There's a concern over judgment from peers, shame deflection, ostracizing, is shared ego defenses, and you have a pressure to fit in to the way things are, and it's so hard to fathom going against the way things are. And that's why we need love and forgiveness, and we got to do this together. And this isn't just a science issue, it's a everyone issue, as long as we're trying that. Yeah, big picture, everyone issue. We got to wake up to what's going on in the big picture. So as a potential path towards solution, parapsychology is consistent with the core messages of love. What it's implying is unity consciousness, which is love. It's a path towards forming a coherent belief systems, like science uprooted what become dogmatic religion. This idea of unity consciousness and spirituality would do the same to our current ideologies. Dealing with, understanding the unconscious. It's a path towards merging science and spirituality, which is exactly what we need. It's a potential forcing mechanism to getting out of the current paradigm. The idea of how do we go about this? Well, this is a way to go about it. And it's not going about it, not dealing with what's the unconscious is. Unconscious information is a microcosm for all of our problems in politics. And it's just crazy. It's just people can't see what's going on because they're so focused on the surface issues, because they're in the habit of repressing the unconscious, and you got to set an example. And we can't solve issues with an incorrect model on consciousness, particularly mental health issues. So having psychic or ESP experiences within a society, particularly Western materialist society, leads to marginalization and can have negative consequences on the individual, despite these are being real experiences. And that's what I experienced, and that's what I came to realize, that it's the unacknowledged roots of all mental health issues in intractable ideological strife. It is the core issue. I had a personal experience involving ESP, precognition, synchronicity, and it ended up being terrifying. I didn't know what was going on because I'm here surrounded by in a culture that thinks things are crazy, and I didn't know. I didn't have any context for it. I thought maybe I was dying, and then afterwards there's no one to talk to. It's like, what are you gonna do? You're gonna go to a psychologist to sort through this when they don't even believe this stuff is real? And it's just a horrible situation. It's what I imagined it as. You can imagine a sexual assault victim. I've never had that happen, but it's kind of the same idea. You have this thing happen to you that you can't talk about. I mean, it's a good thing. You're having your ego burned away, and the long-term effects are good, and there's no good long-term effects to sexual assault. But it's the same idea as you need to talk about it, and you have no one to talk to. And luckily, I have a neuroscience background and had an interest in psychology, so I was able to look towards Jung and piece together this, and that's what led to all of this, and figuring this stuff out, all with the help of a higher power and God. But if what people were trying to tell me is you're going crazy, you're getting, you need help, and this is it's clearly been an experience of God, and you can imagine that children who are having these unconscious spiritual urges in people in general, but it's and you're in a culture where these things don't exist, and that is a dangerous situation. These children, we don't know what the extent of it is, but we do know we're putting a lot of kids on ADHD medication, antidepressants, and this general public also. When it's true, it's I don't know if whoever's listening to this is going to believe this, but it's factually true that the only thing we really want in life is to wake up to our spiritual truth. There's a lot of different ways to go about that, but that's what our minds are trying to, that's what we're programmed to try to go about learning, working up to the truth. And if you're not, and if you're a culture that suppresses that, then what is actually a normal, healthy function can ruin your life, can ostracize you, can cause a mental health issue that can't be solved because you're never going to get at the issue within current methods of psychology. And it's a very sad. Instead of having someone to talk to, you're having to seeing that this is helping, like trying to make sense of what happened to the what might have happened to them and what they're experiencing in this, and it just gets reversed into a pathology. And Dr. Jack Hunter talks about this issue. He had a quote in his paper, the same issue. He talked about that these spiritual experiences are turned into pathology, but the reality is that society is pathological in general. And because we have a field that is trying to make sense of the world, come to, the belief is we're trying to make objective sense of something like the mind and consciousness. And that's not at all what they're doing. They're defending, everyone is defending a model, a particular model. And that model is obviously wrong. And then from that model, we come up with our theories and methodologies as to treat mental health. And it's not, and that's never going to work, because what you're doing is you're trying to shoehorn in this spiritual being into a robot, and you're treating them as if they have no souls and assuming that's the case, and that's not going to work. If you're going to, it just doesn't make any sense. As to it's worrying about what there's wrong with them when it's us trying to fit them into something they're not. It's like trying to tell a dog that it's a goldfish. It's like, so you have this dog and you're concerned, like, it doesn't swim well, it doesn't like the water, it can't even hold its breath. Maybe we should give it some medication so that it can hold its breath longer. And it's like, it's not a goldfish, it's a dog. And that's the problem. It's not we need more medication, we don't need to yeah, that's very sad. And this Friedrich Nietzsche predicted all this. He's a prophet he is a prophet, because he predicted the modernist movement and birth of ideology in the 19th century. He predicted God is dead. So God is dead, spirituality is dead. Then there's going to have to be a replacement for that, and that's ideology. And now ideology is kind of getting obviously crazy. And now what? Are we going to let our kids go crazy and let everyone suffer, or are we going to follow the truthful path towards what's going on? We're going to wake up, basically. And yeah, this study is a quote from a study. This study illustrates how 19th century romantic and transcendental assertions regarding supernaturalism predicted science's limitations. The most dangerous condition for a man or a nation is when his intellectual side is more developed into his spiritual side. So the point is that this stuff is very obvious. It's so clear and it makes so much sense, and it's so weird that something so clear could be resisted so much. And that is the problem we've always faced. And to look back on history, the paranormal has been a normal part of during human evolution. So our ideas like this stuff is not normal. That's only a recent belief. Shamans and mystics were the leaders of the tribe and attended to psychological, social, and cultural needs. They communicated with spirits, and a lot of what they learned later becomes validated by science. For example, how it's an incredible story on how they even learned to create DMT from ayahuasca, because ayahuasca alone is inactive because the DMT gets broken down right away. So you actually need two plants. So here they are, and they're in a rainforest that has 70,000, 80,000 plants. And they brought together the two plants that they needed to create this hallucinogen. And they've asked them, how'd they do that? I mean, that's amazing. And they're like, well, the snake spirits told us. And what do you say to that? You got to take their word for it. That's incredible. The spirits told them to go find these two plants. It's just another instance of how much we suppress, because that's obviously important to who we are. The fact that there is a spirit realm. In movies, books, and technology is kind of reflecting this unconscious. Today, mystics of the past in a Western culture would be medicated, labeled and crazy, perhaps have their life ruined. If I wouldn't have been able to make sense of this, my life would have been ruined. It's very selfish it's fear. They need love, but it's just not seeing the big picture, not recognizing what's going on is killing people. You imagine these gun violence kids. Of course they're going to go crazy. That's our fault, We're expecting them to be mentally healthy while telling them there's something that we're not, and not just telling them there's something that we're not, making what they actually are crazy. And that's actually happening. It's pathological to have ESP. It's pathological to have precognition or spiritual experiences. It's just a hallucination. And that's the mainstream, that's the prevailing view, is that this stuff is just an hallucination, and it's not. That's a big problem. That's it's ruining lives. That's what's motivating me. I had started with aligning you before I had my experiences trying to help kids find meaning and purpose, and that's still the same thing. But now I just realized that the bigger picture of what's actually going on, that I was being motivated for this, to help these kids who are suffering because of our own willful ignorance as a culture, our inability to deal with the truth. So I call it the strife archetype. I had called it the Nazi archetype, but I thought maybe I shouldn't do that. But that's what it is. Because you can imagine the Holocaust did not happen overnight. The Holocaust was gradual, and the strife archetype is ignoring and suppressing the truth because of social pressures to maintain the status quo, or ego maintenance loop. So Einstein, he noticed something was going on. He was trying to warn people about this gradual disintegration of reason. He's called it a giving in to unreason. And that's the same thing now. And the people who know better need to wake up. And this could we're headed in a crossroads. Basically, are we going to be honest, or are we going to go along with, are the people who know better going to go along with the suppression and not talk about these deeper issues? Or are they going to, is something like this going to be heard and just repressed like everything else? You know, it's an inability to, yeah, just going along with the status quo and neglecting what's actually going on. And that's what spiritual awakening describes as no longer ignoring what's going on, because yeah, there's a long history of inability to integrate truth. It's not dealing with it because of fear, and it is fear because it's not easy to acknowledge the fact that things aren't as they were. It's much easier to stay asleep. In the long run, it's going to be better for you to just wake up, because we don't know about reincarnation, those ideas, but it could be a situation where you don't get to graduate until you wake up, or you don't get to go on to something better until you wake up. Maybe you suppressing the truth now continues, because when the end of life review at death, I realized that's probably real, because when I had my my death and spiritual rebirth, I had my own life review, and the unconscious just automatically projects that out into your reality. So what I presume is that everything you repress and don't deal with in this life, the repressions go away. The unconscious is going to flood up into your reality at death, because this is all about dealing with repressions, and you don't get to repress your issues at the point of after you die. So not dealing with this now is going to spell perhaps bad things for you after death. And that's why love and forgiveness, it's really that simple. That's what Jesus taught. He taught love and forgiveness, because these things are painful until you see them in the context. And that's what I'm working on, putting these things into their context, and they're not so scary. Yeah. So it's an archetype, because this going along with the group beliefs is what leads to atrocities. That's how people become possessed. That's how an individual, a normal citizen, can become a psychopathic murderer in something like the Holocaust. They were regular people, but they just went along with it, and they're not conscious of it. They're just zombies. When someone is just asleep and unconscious, you can get them to do anything, basically. And that's the problem. And that's why within science and parapsychology, integrating that is a path towards waking people up, because it's associated with the unconscious and naturally leads to self-reflection. And that's why it's avoided, but it's actually the solution to all these problems. And it's naturally going to be challenging dealing with a paradigm changing knowledge. Like, that's normal. An excerpt on this Einstein during World War II is relevant to today. Few scientists in Germany found the fortitude to show active resistance to the strifes. That partly reflects how rare physical courage is, and who are we to judge them for that? But this isn't really the issue. Those German scientists who had no sympathy for the National Socialists didn't just stay silent to save their own skins and careers, they considered it their duty to do so. You could grumble in private, but as a professional academic, one was expected to remain apolitical, a loyal, patriotic servant of the state. When Einstein denounced the strife laws publicly, he was vilified when he denounced the Nazi laws publicly, he was vilified as a traitor to his country, an atrocity mongerer who deserved to be expelled from scientific institutions. This attitude explains much of the post-war silence of German scientists. It's not just that they lacked the honesty and self-awareness to confess, as Dutch physicist Hendrik Casimir did. It's that they were held back by fear. Most of them didn't even feel there was a case to be answered. Their aim, instead, had simply been to stay true to the science, an inspiration that became a shield against any recognition of broader civic responsibilities. And that's what's going on now, is staying silent to the broader civic responsibilities because of a claim to be staying true to science. But that's not even the case. We know that there's science is not staying true to science. It's just defending dogmatic beliefs at this point, and that's very clear from any self-reflection on what's going on, but also parapsychology, and not just parapsychology, but the history of spiritual and supernatural. So a field like psychology isn't staying true to science either. It's being defending discovering knowledge within a pre-existing paradigm and ignoring that which could actually help solve the issues it claims to be concerned about, like mental health of youth. And it's afraid of the science and afraid of civic responsibility, but they're actually the same issue, because being true to the science would be how they issued the broader civic responsibilities, because they exist within this same loop. So they could stand up to civic issues by just being actually true to the science. So another quote for Einstein: "I can now understand the passive response of the whole civilized world to this modern barbarism. Does the world not see Hitler as aiming at war? Einstein had spoken at home and abroad against the collective surrender unto reason he saw around him." So I can resonate, not Einstein, but I can resonate with what he's going through, because that's how people treated me. They think I'm being an atrocity monger, and I'm seeing the same things that he saw. He was obviously a very abstract thinker in his ability to, with his thought experience, and see things. That's how I've always been, but I mean, I got to give credit to God, because I didn't come up with this stuff. And if you gave credit to God, but probably not. But God is very abstract, and I talk about that in a previous episode. Current manifestations of this insanity and repression projection, where we don't have any solutions for these issues, like the violent Berkeley incidences. We spend 800,000 and 600,000 in security because we can't actually address the issue. They physically shut down the bridge over race. Evergreen College, a professor, there was a day on campus that they were going to have no whites on campus, and he was like, "That's not reasonable." And then he got mobbed for that. He feared for his life. He was running from them. Michigan students were jailed for passing out these pamphlets about free speech. They got jailed for trespassing, which later ended up they weren't actually trespassing. Attack on free speech is dangerous. This is all dangerous. There was a 6 months inquisition over a joke that appeared racist. That's, again, there's such hostility towards anything that leads to self-reflection in unconscious, and it's prevalent anywhere. We have the 2016 election. There's no self-awareness on how that was just a symptom of a culture that's lost and confused, and we're focused on the election and Trump versus Hillary, but we can't see that it's actually a part of a bigger picture, a paradigm, something that's always been going on. And by focusing on Trump or Hillary, that allows us for a distraction from the deeper issues. and we share in that. It becomes normal to do that, and it becomes, well, everyone else is doing it, so I can do it too. And that's the attitude that leads to something like the Holocaust, because that's the attitude of being unconscious, being asleep, a zombie. I mean, that's the danger. Not being asleep is a danger for all of us. We tend to address surface issues. Scientism facilitates by being a part of it. It's not their fault, but they're not separate from culture. Examples of cultural avoidance, of how we avoid in today's culture. How do we avoid these painful truths? Well, we have cell phone use, checking cell phones all day, pontification on surface issues, Republicans, Democrats, Trump, Obama, reality TV stars, movies. Sports is another one. Sports, people are very focused on sports teams, and that's fine, but it's also a mechanism for which we can get by let it all slide while stuff goes on that we're ignoring. Pretending something is making things better and using that other people think it as evidence. In science, there's kind of this researching things, but and treating them as relevant to the issues they're trying to be solved, but well, they're not really. They're just very associated with them, but not really addressing that in a real way, because that can only happen through what the unconscious higher self is telling us. I've talked about that and we'll continue talking about that, why it's unconscious is the place to be for actually making things better, integrating it. It's always been true. In Netflix, TV and movies, and I talked about The Walking Dead and zombies, how it's funny that they're so popular at a time. It's the unconscious. Wake up! And slavery, projecting onto other people your issues and making them less than human when it's really you. Persecutions of the Christians, those people, they stood up for what they believed in and they got burned at the stake for it. Like, if you're not like, that's powerful, and like that's honorable. I don't think people in their beliefs today would burn at the stake for them, because they're just, yeah. But then on the flip side, like Roman Catholic Church persecuted people like witch and mystics, Holocaust, and that's when it became dogmatic, and then it had to get replaced. And yeah, Holocaust, again, ignoring the problems of and projecting it onto Jewish people. The reality of the situation is that we're all avoiding an issue under our noses. The fact that we are even here is incredible. Even without parapsychology, like the fact that we're here is just ignored. It's so incredible. Yeah. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? If not us, then who? Like, this is a crossroads. We can either ignore this and pretend it's not an issue, or let it just take over. And there's wisdom in living your own life and letting it all go. There's people who are awake, but you live within this system. If you have a world war scenario, that's going to affect you regardless. You're not going to be able to live your own life. So, but I can understand that, because it seems like such an impossible situation that's been going on since the beginning of time. But that itself is a limiting belief. Why couldn't we change it? Why couldn't we at least try? And that's what we're doing. We're trying. It's worth trying, because there's souls and children suffering because of us. It's our fault. And it's going to be solved by more science. It's going to be solved by being reasonable and acknowledging what we know and opening our eyes. So I have a diagram here of how things tend to work. So you're a high school student, you're growing up, you're going to college, and then you have a few options. You can go into identify with ideology A, ideology B, or a career, and just have apathy to it all. And that just perpetuates the conflict because the people who are ideology possessed are just perpetuate it. So the only solution to that is by creating a identification, a spiritual identification that can unite people around being spiritual beings, because that's what we all are. We're not ideological people who kill people because of a Holocaust. Like that's who we're acting like, but that's not who we are. We're so the difference is, so in the ideologically Nietzsche's God is dead situation, the unconscious is ignored. Science says we are machines. Spiritual experiences, including ESP, are just hallucinations to be suppressed or medicated. It's important to believe what other people believe for survival in the group. In the reintegration of spirituality, understanding the unconscious becomes relevant to growth and happiness. It means we are divine beings. We're identifying with our true selves, not some ideology. Psychic phenomenon become real and something to be cultivated instead of feared. And yeah, a society that prioritizes scientism over truth about our being is going to have these problems. And it's don't be surprised if everything just continues to get worse as you try to make things better, as not just any as a culture. Taking the red pill, it really is like taking the red pill in the Matrix. Again, what it's doing, it's unearthing stuff you have been suppressing, and that's how you get to a higher state, and that's kind of a more peaceful state, because it's kind of like these fears and repressions are holding you down, kind of like gravity holds you down. There's a reason Jesus and Buddha don't come around, but you can't get to a state of peace and enlightenment without first dealing with the depression, guilt, anxiety, and that's what the barrier to it is. That's why it's so not very many. That's why it's rare, because it's not the easiest thing to do. But I think we can do this collectively, and it won't be as bad. Well, it'll be good. We can do it together. And there's a lot of help online. The internet's been a great development for all of this, because now, like I would have just been probably put in an insane asylum, put out or medicated if it wasn't for the internet, because I had no one in my life. I found Kevin Rice through the internet. I was able to read Jung and search this stuff and find people online, and that's what it's like enrapture ourselves and wake up in ways that we couldn't before. We got to take advantage of it. Like, people died for this. People died for our ability to find this information, and it'd be a shame to just just not take advantage of it. We don't know. This could be important to your soul, spiritually, and the afterlife, and it's not going to be, not to push any particular beliefs, but believing in lies and going along with a paradigm that's wrong isn't going to be how to improve your position for any afterlife. That's repression. I believe that this whole reality is kind of like a dealing with the unconscious repression, perhaps. At least that's part of it. So if you're here and you're not dealing with your repressions, and that includes the repressions of society, or at least coming to understand them, then you're not doing what you were here to do. And that's, corroborated by many other philosophies. And doing thy will is to not be a zombie. Yeah, and we got to forgive ourselves. We're all wounded and afraid. We're all still reeling from the world wars, slavery, eugenics, and this is what I'm talking about: dealing with that stuff and forgiving it. Forgiving it. The way to do that is realize that we're dreaming. It's unconscious. Your whole life can be acted out unconsciously, and you can do things, but it wasn't really you. Or it wasn't really them. They were just unconscious, like a school shooter. It's like he was just an unconscious person, like us. He's one of us, and as long as if you're not helping reveal the truth or change the paradigm, you are just like the shooter, basically. I mean, that sounds extreme, but they need love. It's not their fault. It's all of our fault. And yeah, awareness of the unconscious and projection removes blocks to greater compassion. Long-term perspective, future plans, contacting researchers and interested groups about this stuff, have testimonials from victims of stigmatization, awakening you and only loving thoughts. Just stay tuned on all that through social media. Okay, general schematic. So we got to create awareness, just this path with parapsych. Create awareness of parapsychology, the travesty of marginalization, how that's affecting our youth. Describe the importance of unconscious issues and how this has been playing out over time. And this puts all of history into context. And then that can reduce the stigmatization and marginalization of psychic phenomena like we need to do in spirituality. It's the only way we solve this. And that's definitively true. Parapsychology and the unconscious become increasingly recognized as essential as this ideas, because we're not just integrating new knowledge, we're affecting the whole loop. That's the only way to go about it and really have the positive impact. The profanity of ideas are increasingly recognized within culture over time, and then implications for humanity can become realized as science and spirituality merge. And that's really the one goal. That'd be the goal, to just be honest about what the evidence says and just do our jobs. That's it. Do what we claim to be doing consciously. And corruption and fear are incompatible with the knowledge of an awake public. It just can't exist. That stuff only exists in the shadows of ignorance. I have a diagram here. So only loving thoughts. We're not sure. We're working on it, but the actual format of it, just one idea, is create a unified spiritual message, and then get people to get behind it and bring some kind of structure and unity and focused effort to the whole New Age movement. Go big or go home. It can't. These ideas are so big that you're not, unless you're trying to change everything, it's not really understanding it, because that's, well, like I said, there's wisdom in just keeping to yourself, but that's not why I'm here. I remembered why I'm here. It's not to just, well, I can't say that for sure, but I woke up to, I'm here to try to help these children, youth, everyone. And I got some myths. The myth, this doesn't matter to me. This is other people's problem. That's not true. It's not true, because you can't, if you're unconscious to it, then you're not doing what you think you are doing, whatever you do. you're getting sabotaged. And yeah. And another myth, we can't be sure about this stuff. There's enough evidence. That's not true. The evidence is ignored and it can't be integrated. Some take home messages: extrasensory perception and other psychic phenomena are real, but fall outside science's culture ego loop. Society's issues are due to shared fear-based repressions of unconscious, creating irrationality like the time map myth, repressions, and we got to deal with it. So it's not a new idea. There may be ongoing mental health. There is an ongoing mental health crisis due to science telling people that they are something they are not and marginalizing spiritual phenomenon. The merging of science and spirituality represents a path towards potential peaceful globalization. Support by people who share, who understand the logic, can help spread awareness, because obviously some people aren't ready to understand this. But the people who do, we need your help if this is actually going to do, I don't know. But if you understand it, we'd appreciate help. And remember, love and forgiveness. You don't get mad at a child for spilling, a 2-year-old for spilling their milk. They're unconscious. They don't know how to drink out of a cup yet. You forgot to forgive people of the past, but we can honor the victims of the past by learning from it. That's the only thing we can do, and that's the only thing that that's what we do. We got to learn from the past. Okay, that's a long one. Okay. Thanks for listening. Bye.